Good afternoon. My name is Jesse J. Holland. I am the Race, Ethnicity, and Demographics reporter for the Associated Press in Washington. And I want to thank you all for coming to this panel today on the recruitment and retention of
Reporters,
teachers, teachers in America. This is one of the more vexing areas, how to recruit and retain more teachers of color in the American education system. And we have a very distinguished panel here, and hopefully by the time we get finished, we'll have some answers, or at least we'll be getting closer to having some answers to this issue. First things first, let's talk a little bit about the problem. We know that our country is becoming more diverse by the year. Last year, for the first time ever, there were more students of color in America's classrooms than there were white students. Now, just to be clear, white students still make up the largest ethnic group. White students still make up the largest ethnic group in the American education system, but if you add together all of the other ethnic groups, Hispanic, Asian, African American, Native American, those students together, when you add them together, they become the largest group in the American educational system. However, according to the National Center for Education Statistics, the teacher corps is not changing as fast. Right now, 82% of the teachers in America are white. The question that we're going to explore today is why, and if it actually matters. And I'm glad to have two experts here today to help me delve into this issue. First, we have Lily Eskelsen Garcia, who is the president of the National Education Association, the nation's largest labor union. She's the first Latina to lead the 3 million educators and a former Utah Teacher of the Year. She's a graduate of the University of Utah, graduating magna cum laude in elementary education and later earning her master's degree in instructional technology. And we have Dr. Carolyn D. Brown, professor of cultural studies in education in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Texas. She's also the Elizabeth Gibb Teaching Fellow in Education and holds a faculty appointment in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies and the Center for Women and Gender Studies. In 2012, she received the Regents Outstanding Teacher Award, the highest teaching honor given for excellence in undergraduate teaching across the University of Texas system. So we have two knowledgeable panelists here today, and we can expect a great conversation. So before we get started, I also want to say that we're going to start the conversation here, but we want you to join in as well. You can see on the screen our Twitter handles, and we're going to open it up for questions for the panelists later on. So we're going to start the conversation here, and then we want you to join in. Before we get started with the questioning, though, I'm going to give both of my panelists a chance to give a short opening statement and about what they think about our issue of retaining and recruiting teachers of color. And we'll start with Lily.
Okay, because I love the sound of my own voice, and I would love to project. With my sixth graders, you got one jelly bean for a good answer. You got two jelly beans for a good question. So you've asked us a very good question that should lead us to more questions, like, why don't we have a more diverse teaching staff? Before we start finding solutions, we have to ask ourselves why. So I hope that we'll be able to take the time to really look at not only why that's the case, but why it's important. And why it's important not just in communities of color where the majority of kids are African American or Latino kids or American Indian students, but why it's important in every single school that they see faculty, staff that reflect the way America looks. We think that's very important at the National Education Association, and we've been working on this for a long time. We think we've got some ideas about how to make it better.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with you all and to be able to contribute to this conversation, very important conversation around the need for more pre-service teachers of color. I enter into this conversation as a person who works in teacher education, primarily around issues of race and culture. And I am a former classroom teacher myself. And so I'm hoping to add to what we talk about around why it is that we need more teachers of color, and all students in our K-12 school systems need more teachers of color. And so I hope that we'll be able to delve more into those reasons why.
I'm a reporter, so we always go for the hard-hitting, controversial question first, because that way, if the person walks out on you, you've got your story. So we're going to start with the most I think was one of the most controversial issues when we talk about recruiting and retaining teachers of color. Why does it matter? Why does it matter that students see teachers of a different race or ethnicity? Are we saying that white teachers can't teach black kids? Are we saying Hispanic teachers can't teach white kids? Why does it matter? Shouldn't only the skill of the teacher matter? Why does it matter that to have a teacher of a different race or ethnicity in a classroom?
It matters. So that's the answer, does it? And for me, it's so clear that when you're looking at educating the whole child, you're actually looking for a child that is going to be able to move in society, be successful in anything that they choose to do. If that child has only had an experience with one facet of the population, then you're shortcutting that student. You're actually narrowing the experiences that they have. Race in America is still an issue that haunts us. And it haunts us more today, I think, than ever before, because, believe it or not, our society is even more segregated than it was when we thought about legal segregation. It's more likely that you are going to work in an office that has little diversity, that you're going to go to a university that has little diversity, that you're going to live in a community of people who look just like you. Go to church with people who look just like you. And if you can't expand that, you're going to grow up with stereotypes. You're going to grow up only hearing about another group of people, instead of saying, no, I work with that person. I go to school with that person. I sit next to that person. And so for us, everything in our society, if we're ever to really deal with racism, you have to have people know what America looks like. You have to have that personal relationship with someone. And the place that everyone is going to end up, we won't all end up in the same church. But a public school is where 90% of our students will end up. So that's the place you begin.
But is that the responsibility of the public schools or the responsibility of the parents?
So I'm going to piggyback off of that, and hopefully I'll get at that question. I think that it is the responsibility of families and communities, but it's clearly the responsibility of schools. Public schools evolved out of the need to create a citizenry that could participate in a democracy, right? And fundamentally that the democracy that we live in, and that we've always lived in, although we didn't acknowledge it in the ways that we should have, has been a racially diverse space, right? And so it's important that we make sure that our schools are reflecting that larger project. Now, in terms of why we need more teachers of color, and can white teachers, just quite bluntly, can white teachers teach students of color? Of course they can. We have lots of experiences and research that would suggest they can. But we also know that increasingly our worlds are racially homogenous. They're also socioeconomically homogenous. And when over 80% of your teacher population are white female women, right? White women from middle class backgrounds who quite likely lived in homogenous settings, because that's how our communities look, that's how our schools, communities look, our churches look, our friendships, our peer relations, social relations. It's a high likelihood that there's not a lot of understanding about different experiences, worldviews, perspectives that students are going to bring into the classroom. And when much of your work is around making decisions, you have to make a decision about a child's behavior, about a child's ability to learn. If you don't have that sort of cross-cultural competency, it's going to be difficult for you to make the kinds of decisions that need to be made in service for all students. And so it's important that we have teachers of color who bring often those experiences, those diverse experiences into the classroom. Can white teachers learn that? Yes, they can, but we need to have others do that work as well.
You used a very important word. Is it the school's responsibility? Is it the community's responsibility? Yes, 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 and yes. And here's where we're coming from as educators, as teachers in the public school. Schools and education from the beginning of this country and beyond have been used time and time again to hold people back. Girls were not allowed to go to college. We're not going to let women be educated. If you were a slave, you weren't allowed to learn how to read. If you want to oppress someone, the first thing you do is you look at making sure they don't get an education. And for us, as we look at how schools, public schools in particular, have been used as tools of oppression and racism, that was all about Brown versus the board. You go back to places where education was basically a tool of racism, we feel a special obligation, a special responsibility to say where schools were abused and misused to hold certain students down. Now, as educators who get a paycheck from those schools, it's our responsibility as social justice warriors to make sure that we lift those schools and make them places of great diversity and respect. And yes, it is our responsibility.
But when you say our, who's the our there? Is that the federal government? Is that the state government? Is that the teacher corps itself to go out and recruit more? Is that the local school? Is that the school? Who's the our in that sentence?
It's all of the above and more. It's my union. It's my union that has taken this on as something that we said, if we really believe in the cause of public education, we have to believe in making those schools more welcoming, diverse places where all students means all students.
Okay, Carolyn, who do you see that our to be?
In terms of the responsibility?
Yes.
It's all of our responsibility, and it's the responsibility of teachers. I mean, we are charged as teachers to meet the needs of the students who come into our classrooms. We are expected to help them master whatever the learning expectations are for that particular year or for whatever period of time we're working with them. And so we don't have the license to say, well, we're not going to teach you, I don't really understand you. I don't even think that you're a good student. We don't have the right to say that, and that's part of our responsibility. And the role of teacher education is to prepare teachers for the students that they're going to meet. It means that we need to broaden and expand who we bring into the classroom, and that would include teachers of color, who are increasingly, the numbers are they're dropping precipitously.
Well, doing research for this panel, I found out something that was fascinating to me, because in addition to reading stories about education, I've written a few education stories over the last few years, but in preparing for this panel, I found a very interesting number. The Consortium for Policy Research and Education said in 2014 that in 1987 to 88, there were 325,000 minority teachers. By 2011, there was over 666,000 minority teachers. So the numerical number of minority teachers is actually going up. But here's the catch. The same report said that minority teachers are leaving the system in a far faster rate than white teachers. In the 2 decades from the late 1980s to 2008, the annual rate of minority teacher turnover had increased by 28%, which is significantly higher than the turnover rate for white teachers. What's happening here, and can it be reversed? What's causing this high turnover rate for teachers of color?
You're getting a high turnover rate for all teachers, but, and I don't have, this is an opinion based on that, knowing a lot of friends who are teachers of color, saying quite clearly that their hearts are broken. They got into education as a social justice cause. It was something they believed in. And especially with this test and punish, everything that is important in education needs to fit on a standardized test or it doesn't matter, where we ended up in 2002 with no child left untested, and we just got that testing monkey off our back, at least on the federal level. We know that what was happening in the most challenging communities, challenged by poverty, challenged by discrimination, those were the school communities that were told no more sports, no more theater, no more music, if it doesn't, no science fair, technology. Those things you aren't on the reading and math test, and that's all you get, because we've been told that teaching and learning is all about hitting a cut score. And I think for the faculty and staff that worked in those communities being told time and time again, don't be creative, don't serve the whole child unless it can move the cut score, their hearts were broken. And they said, I feel like I'm complicit in hurting children, and they left. And now we have a chance to change things and get people back and keep them. But it's going to take a lot of work. But I believe that's why people leave.
Kathleen, what do you think?
So I'm not familiar with the specific report that you're talking about, but my sense, based on the literature that I know about, would suggest that teachers of color are often teaching in the most challenging settings, right? So they don't have ideal or optimal work conditions, which would lead one to leave. Right. There's also some movement up. So if you are an effective teacher, and you're an effective teacher of color, it is not uncommon to be moved up into a leadership position. And also there's pay issues, right? So teachers don't get paid very well, and you have problematic conditions, and you have exorbitant amounts of accountability that's being placed on you, the expectation that your students are going to achieve at a certain level. Sometimes that creates a narrowing of the curriculum. It just doesn't make a good set of working conditions. And my sense would be that those are some of the key areas why you might see people coming in and coming out. And if teaching only represents sort of a fallback position for many people. Like you can go and get this job because no one else wants to work in that particular school or those particular schools. You go in and then you leave. And so some of those factors around how teaching is positioned as a profession, how it's understood as a profession, we need to do some work on in those areas as well.
And as we're talking about bringing people into the pipeline, I'll just put my bias out there. I'm the son of 2 public school teachers, one in Mississippi and one in Tennessee. So I grew up with teaching issues through my household as a child. And so I've seen personally the disrespect that the teaching profession can get. There's always talk of frustration over the test-heavy policies that come down and the use of the schools as a political laboratory in this country, which happens over and over. And there's also the general disrespect that I would say the American public has for teachers. You get movies like Bad Teacher with Cameron Diaz, which didn't do anything good for the teaching profession or Cameron Diaz's career. And if you went out into the general public and you asked them to name a famous teacher, they'd probably say Yoda or Indiana Jones. They know their children's teachers, but they're the only ones that they know. So when we talk about recruiting people into the teaching profession, one of the first issues we have to deal with is how the American public views teaching. So how do we change that? How do you get teaching to the point where it becomes a desired profession and not like you said, a fallback position for some people? We'll start carefully, how do you get teaching to be that desired profession?
So I think this is an interesting issue, and since you started with a pop culture reference, I'm gonna go back to that. There's a couple of studies that have been done where people have analyzed how teachers are represented in movies, and one of the things that one particular study found is that when we look at Hollywood movies, the ubiquitous teacher generally is a white female, might be a white male. But the only teachers of color that we see in sort of big blockbuster Hollywood type movies are actual teachers, real life teachers. Now, what does that mean? That means that there is something about the construction of the teacher that is inherently white, right? So that the whole notion of who gets to be the teacher is not linked to teachers of color. And I think that has some bearing on how people who are growing up, when they look out into the world and they're trying to figure out what kind of teacher do I want to have, that's not necessarily who is reflected in mainstream hegemonic, what we call dominant discourse. But that's odd, because when we think back to, sort of pre-integration, for black people, teaching was the primary role that they could play, the primary occupation that was made available to college-educated people. And so how we shift this, I mean, it's very complicated, but at one level, there's a need to pay teachers more money. There's also a need to elevate how we think about teachers. Teachers are one of the most maligned professions, or
besides journalists, you mean?
Perhaps, but they are quite maligned, right? They are positioned as often not effective. They're seen as not highly educated. The people who go into teaching are those who can't do anything else, right? And so there needs to be a concerted effort to change that. But I don't think that we can just go on a marketing campaign. I mean, I'm just going to throw out Teach for America as an example. I think Teach for America, the one really positive thing that Teach for America did is they knew how to make teaching sexy, right? They made people believe that this is the profession for you. This is the hot thing to go into, and it's something that you can make a difference in, regardless of the larger politics around it. But I don't think we can just go hire marketers and help us figure out how to make teaching a more marketable profession. I think we need to have a change in political will. There has to be a desire and a belief that we need to change what it means, the importance and power of education, and that everyone, not just those who come from wealthy backgrounds or socioeconomically privileged backgrounds need an education, everyone deserves an education. And until we have that, until that becomes the sort of political will of our country, I think it's going to be hard to change it. Teaching as a profession started out really as a feminized profession, right? Which is one of the reasons why it's underpaid. I mean, that's the history. If you go back, it was positioned as this role that women could go in, and it's just the natural work of women, right? And so what we're talking about is a much bigger sociocultural phenomena of living here in the U.S. And we need to change that, uproot that.
Lily, how do we change the perception of teaching to make it, I don't want to say sexy, but
No, that word works.
how
for
do we do
me.
that?
I love that word.
How do we do that in America?
It has to be real. It can't be and I actually had a friend that said, I wish we could put on commercials. I wish we could like show people, it was the movie thing, where they're watching like a Hallmark commercial where everybody loves teachers. And I said, please don't do that. Please don't even think about asking NEA or someone else to do that. It has to be real. We know why people are leaving the profession, because they don't feel respected and they don't feel like they've been given authority to do the creative, collaborative work that they always thought teaching would be. So you have to start with something that's real. No Child Left Untested left us with no authority. It was tying both hands behind our back, saying everybody needs to be on page 63. This is how you're going to teach math and reading. You're going to read a script from a textbook that someone in the district office bought. And they check the box and they go, there, we're teaching. And folks who said, the only way I can teach is if I close the door and hope nobody sees that I'm actually teaching today. And you know what? The kids picked up on that. They picked up on the fact that my teacher is not in charge. Why in the world would we expect them to want to go into something like education when they saw the frustration of their teachers? What we have now, that No Child Left is gone, is we now have a new law that is supposed to be defined on the state and local level. What kind of dashboard of indicators of student success are you going to be working on? And you have to include, by federal law, the voices of the people who know the names of those kids in planning what is going to happen in that school. We have a chance now to really take on that collaborative authority that we haven't had for a decade. There are some teachers who started teaching since 2002 who've never taught under anything but No Child Left. I started teaching 1 million years ago, before I knew that I wasn't supposed to be creative, caring, and collaborative. We just did it because no one stopped us, and it was the best way to teach. We can move the needle now and go back to something that's really exciting, where the kids go, wow, my teacher loves this. My teacher's hair is on fire. I want to do this. It's got to be real. The kids have to feel it. And then we'll start working on new movies.
Right. Okay, but those are both 20,000-foot views, changing the federal law, No Child Left Behind. What do we do at the state and the local level? In fact, let me be specific. Give me your best recruiting pitch to a high school student to become a teacher, especially to a student of color who has to worry about college bills. Let's assume that the normal teacher not only has to have a bachelor's degree, will also have to do at least a master's degree. We'll have to worry about licensing tests. What's your best pitch to a student of color, to a Hispanic student, to a black student, to an Asian student, to a Native American student? What's your pitch to them to join the teaching profession?
It's still the pitch that sold me 300 years ago when I was, and by the way, my first job in a public school I was the lunch lady right out of high school. There was no one in my family that had gone to college. That was not an expectation. And it was in a Head Start program, and I got a job as a teacher's aide in the Head Start program. I was 20 years old before some kindergarten teacher said, you're really good with kids, and you should go to college. And I went to college, and I didn't have a crushing student loan when it was all over. I put myself through college, and I think I owed $5,000 or $6,000 at the end of 4 years.
Which doesn't sound like much now, but.
Right. But I mean, and they give you 10 years to pay it off, $50 a month. I mean, it was very, very doable, even on a poor teacher's salary. So the first thing, those are two questions. What would my pitch be? And then how would I get that kid to help afford to do what I was able to do? But the pitch that sold me as I was looking at these kids, first of all, that I was really good at it. And second of all, look what I did. This kid loves reading. This kid, who was fighting with everybody and being a bully, learned something about how to work with another kid. I did that. I am so full of myself because it was the most powerful thing I had ever seen. And I got to stand back and go, these kids' lives are going to be different because I gave this kid a hug and I encouraged this kid and I told this kid, you better not. And everything you did that day, the thousands of decisions that you had to make as a teacher, impacted the life of a real-life human being. There is nothing that has ever made me feel that powerful. That's the sales pitch. But then you have to actually make a classroom now where you can say, I have that authority, I have that power.
Carefully, you're in teacher education, so what's your pitch to get students of color to even A, consider teaching, and B, get past the debt that is going to accrue to become a teacher, which you're not going to start with a great, we all know you're not going to start with a great salary. So it's a bit of a personal sacrifice to become a teacher. What's your pitch to get students into the teaching profession?
Well, college is expensive across the board, regardless of what you choose to major in, right? So there's a high likelihood that you will have debt when you come out of college. And the vast majority of positions that you might go into won't necessarily pay a whole lot of money, right? I don't think that we can offer at this point in the society that we live in now any kind of a pitch that would diminish the cost that the cost of getting a college degree and needing to pay back loans and the disparity between how much you might make as a teacher. I don't think that that's where we would have to land. For me, I made the decision ultimately because it was important work, and I think helping. What I try to do is to help my students to recognize that there is no profession in this world. I saw a meme about this on Facebook recently. There's no profession on this earth that one did not have to go through many teachers to get to, right? And so teaching is fundamental to the work that we do. And as a person of color, looking at the society that we're living in, the times that we're living in, it's a political act to choose to teach. Right? And so for me, when I'm working with students who seem deeply concerned about the future, deeply concerned about communities that they feel have been underserved, that are often dispossessed, I can't imagine that there's any profession that would be more fulfilling, more important than teaching. And that's the pitch that brought me in. It's the pitch that I think continues to bring when we are able to get students of color. The research would bear that most of them go in for the very reason that I laid when they go into traditional teacher education programs in particular.
I'm going to ask one more question here, and then we'll open it up to the audience for any questions. So get your questions for these great panelists ready. What do you see as the greatest barrier to students of color? Well, the New York Times had a story last year that talked about the licensing tests and the difficulties that teachers of color that's coming out of college they were having on the licensing test. One of the tests is the Praxis Core, where which apparently is given in 31 states. The first time that white candidates took it, 55% passed the math portion on their first try. But the passing rate for first-time African-American test takers was only 21%, and for Hispanic test takers, 35%. We saw similar gaps for the reading and writing portions. We can see that as one impediment to teachers of color. But what do you see as the greatest impediment for students of color to get into the teaching profession? Lily?
Their parents. You have 2 kids.
I do.
Let's say they're 18 years old, they're about to start college, they just graduated, they say, Dad, I want to be a teacher. What are you going to say?
I'm going to smile and say, baby, whatever makes you happy.
Good for you, Dad. Good. And one of my best friends, who is a middle school science teacher. Her parents very well educated, not very wealthy, just very well educated. Her father a pastor, and when she graduated from high school and started college, their kids were going to college. She was on her way to law school. And she did some some substitute teaching, just to make a little extra money, and she was hooked. She said, I'm good at this and I love it. She went back and told her dad, I want to be a teacher, and he just about locked her in her room to keep her from that and said, this is a different time. You don't have to be a teacher anymore, just like you were saying, that was the gateway. There were so few colleges of education open to African Americans. You could be a teacher, you could be a pastor. It was like you're doing something different. I think especially now, African American parents are going to resist their own children choosing to be teachers, and part of that is because the pay is low, and because the prestige is low, and the respect is low. The only people that really respect what we do, I think completely, are the professionals themselves. So we respect each other. We know how important our work is, and we are always fighting against that stream of people telling us, you're just a teacher. And we don't believe it. We know they're wrong, but you do get weary. You do get weary.
So I think it kind of connected to what Lily just laid out. We have, saying we, but people of color have more opportunities now to go into a variety of different professions, and I think that has had a bearing on the diminished numbers for African Americans, for sure, going into the field. And I think, of course, people have they make cost-benefit analyses in their lives, and they're trying to figure out, does it make sense for me to do this when maybe I can do something else? So I think that's one piece of it. But another piece of it also could be that if you did not do well in schools yourself, if school didn't do right by you, you may not want to be in schools. I mean, sometimes there's a desire to not go into those programs. I would say that those are two big ones. I was in a group. I had an opportunity to speak to a group last night, and I asked, it was a group of about 60 African-American students at the University of Texas at Austin, and I said, I'm in the College of Education. How many of you are in the College of Education and planning on becoming teachers? One. In the very back of the room, one. And, I did my pitch. While I was up there. But I think some of it has to do with having other opportunities that are made available. And when the status of the profession is low and there's not a lot of money, there's got to be some other impetus to bring them in.
Well, I want to open it up to questions from our audience.
My name is Naomi Shelton. I am Director of K-12 Advocacy for the United Negro College Fund. I am not a teacher. I studied English. People assumed that I would be a teacher because of that. My grandmother was a 35-year career teacher and was very influential in me making the decision not to teach. However, my question is, how are teacher preparation programs in schools working with teachers' unions to evolve and really think through and work through how to evolve teaching?
Thank you for that question, because our union really is hand in glove with colleges of education. And we're working right now to take a look at what needs to change. Some of it comes with what Jesse, you were saying about the praxis test and these kind of gateway tests that have been shown to have bias and to disadvantage some students and advantage others. That can't be the only gateway into teaching and learning. One of the things that NEA has just done is we took a massive survey of new teachers, folks that just got into the business of education. We've asked them their job satisfaction. We've asked them what they plan on doing. We were appalled that a large percentage said, I think I made a mistake. This is not what I thought it was. I don't have the support that I need. And when we asked them about the kinds of support they were talking about, they said, I would have liked to have had a one-year residency program under a master teacher, an experienced teacher. I would have loved to have had a mentor who could come in and observe me. They have some very realistic, doable suggestions for us. And what we have to do is to take that and work with colleges of education to say, this is one way to keep, and recruiting them is one thing, but then you get them there. How do you keep them if you're going to make them feel so isolated and unprepared? Residency programs, mentor programs, collaborative working conditions. That's what they do in places like Finland. That's what they do in places like Canada and Singapore. And what do you know? They score at the top of all of the international rankings because they have such a strong career professional approach to training their teachers.
I think I'll just reinforce that. I think there needs to be more of a connection between pre-service teacher preparation and the career of teachers, particularly the first 3 years, the induction period, which is probably the most important period. It's where we often lose teachers, right? And teacher education programs sort of move from the perspective that they know that when they put a teacher out there, that teacher is not where that teacher is going to end up. We are preparing them to begin that process. That process needs to continue. I would say, though, that teacher education programs also have to do more work to make sure that the program itself is conducive to teachers of color, that those spaces can benefit from, can learn from, and address any unique experiences and perspectives and forms of knowledge that pre-service teachers bring into programs. And one of the things that we know is that often our teacher education programs are not designed with pre-service teachers in mind, not our predominantly white institutions. They often are preparing or moving from the perspective that they're preparing white teachers who may not know the kinds of cultural knowledge that's necessary in order to be a teacher, an effective teacher with students of color. And so teacher education programs are increasingly trying to work on that. I think you want to make sure that you have the right space when you bring them to your program, right? And then that you're able to bridge what they learn in those programs with what they'll be doing once they get into the classroom.
Next question. Stand up and let us know who you are.
Hello, my name is Steve Oates. I work for Deans for Impact, a nonprofit teacher prep advocacy organization right here in Austin. Former teacher educator. My question is about support for teachers of color. In some ways, teachers of color face significant disadvantages that other teachers do not face. They're more likely to come from disadvantaged schools, and this kind of goes back to the earlier question about passing praxis tests and things of that nature. And then once they graduate, they're more likely to go and teach in more challenging environments. And so what can be done for teachers of color, especially those who go to HBCUs or minority-serving institutions, who come from educational backgrounds that are not as strong, who are going into more challenging schools, to support them particularly in their work, not just as teachers, but as teachers of color working in those particular environments?
You want to take a first stab at that?
I can try a bit. I don't have a specific plan that I can lay out for you right now, but what I will say is that I think there's a lot to be learned from historically black colleges and universities, I mean, they historically have been places where teachers have been trained. And one of the things we know from the 50s and the 40s, even into the present, that there's a wealth of knowledge that black teachers period, and often black women, we've done a lot of research on trying to extrapolate the kinds of knowledge, pedagogical expertise that come out of the experiences of black women teachers. It's untapped, really important work. HBCUs that have historically had open enrollments have basically said, we'll take whoever comes through the door. Like, there's something really powerful about that. We take any student who's come from any kind of a background, and we will prepare you to be successful in life. And HBCUs have done that and have continued to do that work well. I think there's a lot to be learned from those spaces that we haven't been able to learn, or at least, or perhaps we haven't respected enough to go and try to get that information. But I do think that we need to find ways to support, and one of the ways that we need to support is to understand, if we have these tests, that we need to figure out, how do we help students to get through the test? The test should not be a barrier to someone being a teacher. A test is not going to tell us if someone is going to be an effective teacher or not. Now this is the world according to Kefferlin, right? And so we need to figure out how to help our students to pass those tests and to not use those as barriers to get into schools, because we know historically they have been biased, and we have institutions all over this country where, you know, students may have not done well on a test, didn't even have to take a test to get into the university, and they've gone on to do quite well. I think we need to advocate that. We need to say that. We need to let policymakers know that, and we need to remind them of those histories at one basic level.
I love that about the HCBUs. What we can learn from open enrollment colleges and universities is amazing, as more and more universities think of being more selective, which means limiting your enrollment to people who already do well when they walk through the door, not because of anything you taught them, but you just carefully select those that you know will be successful, instead of saying we take everybody. I love that. I would add to that, going back to the premise of that, Stephen, that you talked about, that our minority teachers may have come from more challenging circumstances themselves, and are less prepared for a rigorous college than suburban white students. But that begs the question, why? And it all comes down to equity of resources that they should have had in their school. And then when you say, and then they may be more likely to be placed in those challenged communities of poverty, which are still, unfortunately, our high minority communities. The vicious cycle that you just described can only end when we start holding people accountable. They love that word when it means which teacher gets punished for not having their kids hit a cut score. But the same people that would use that accountability word would never want to be held accountable for making sure that all students have the proper resources, have equitable resources, programs, services, and support. And again, this is the piece of the new law, the Every Student Succeeds Act. They keep naming the Elementary and Secondary Education Act something prettier every time it's reauthorized. Now the pretty name is Every Student Succeeds. But we have something in this law where the dashboard of success indicators that now will be determined. One of the things we got, and I got to sit with Lamar Alexander and Patty Murray, the senators that helped make this happen. And I said, no one's ever been held accountable for service and supports. And Republicans that I was arguing with said, and Democrats too, by the way, said, well, you can't mandate something like equitable service supports programs. And I said, you can't mandate that they do it, but the federal government can mandate transparency. Who gets those services and supports and which kids don't? All we're saying is it should be public knowledge. Until we start moving the needle on equitable services and supports, we are continuing to have a school system that holds some students back. And that is not acceptable. And so now we've got this. We are working with 50 state legislatures to say, why not an indicator that says which high schools are graduating students who have already earned college credit before they graduate? Where are the counselors? Where are the social workers? Where's the school nurse, the school librarian? Who has services and supports, and which students don't? When we start moving on that, then we're going to start answering the problem that you just described.
I think we have time for a couple of more questions.
Hi, my name's Dan Brown. I'm a National Board Certified teacher, and I'm now out of the classroom serving as co-director of Educators Rising. So we're a national network of grow your own high school-based teacher academy programs. Yes, huge shout out to Lilly and NEA Center for Great Public Schools for partnering with us to recruit the next generation. So we make this pitch all the time to help communities make the pitch, and it's about impact is the rhetorical part, but clinical student teaching internships and experiential learning to actually try out teaching is great. So we have 14,000 students now. Half are students of color. They're 16, 17, 18-year-olds all fired up. Many of them then go to higher ed where they're received sort of inconsistently. So Dr. Brown, you kind of touched on this, but I'm curious to hear more specifically maybe where this is going well or what needs to change, because higher ed seems very passive in terms of proactively recruiting and supporting the next generation of teachers, especially teachers of color. Could you say more about what we need to see there on the higher ed side? Because I think like 85% of teachers come through traditional university-based teacher prep. This is where we're counting on them to get it right.
So I think that the idea of grow your own programs and starting in high school is something I've thought a lot about, and I haven't done a lot of work in it, but it's something I've been thinking a lot about in the last couple of years. And I do think that that is a place where university programs have to find ways to partner up, and I think it would be great to partner up with school districts as a way to sort of bring in or give high school students opportunities to try out teaching as a future profession. When I meet with my students, one of the first questions I meet with all of my students, and I ask them, the ones that are planning on becoming teachers, what led you to become a teacher? And most of the ones who say they want to be a teacher, it was either related to the fact that their parents were educators, and so they grew up seeing it, or they had an opportunity to either tutor or do something in their high school that led them that way. Or when they got into college, they'd started out in one major, but they were asked to do some volunteer work, and they worked with students, and they decided, oh, I'm pretty good at this. So there's something about that sort of internship, volunteer opportunity that I think we need to have in place. But beyond just growing your own in that way, right, so that you have students that are coming through these programs and then they come into universities. We also need to be able to offer them a position and potentially have some benefits that are connected to that position. Maybe it's some loan forgiveness, right? So I think we need to be more creative and proactive in these measures, but it won't just be teacher education programs, right? Because a teacher education program can't decide whether a student's going to be accepted into a university. So I think there's several layers that we have to work through, but it would be nice to have more community partnerships. And it's something that I'm hoping to maybe do some work in our own program thinking about. Because I think exactly what you're doing is going to be one of the important ways to do this. I also think that we need to get non-traditional teachers, people who may have not wanted to become a teacher, maybe took on another profession, but they live in a community and see there's a need to teach, and they should have an entry point through our traditional teacher education programs, maybe alternative routes through colleges of education where they can get a teaching certification as well, and bringing them back into the classroom. But I think we're going to have to think more creatively if we're going to bring more pre-service more teachers of color into the classroom.
Anything quick you want to add on there, Lily?
Just yay, educators writing, and formerly known future teachers of America, and high school clubs, which sounds kind of soft, but it's not. This is where you start to grow that energy. I've been to one of the national conferences, like 1,000, literally more than 1,000 of these young people. I was exhausted, just the energy in the room. And these were folks that couldn't wait to be teachers. But I will tell you, I didn't see a lot of black and brown faces. I didn't see a lot of boys. There were a lot of girls there. And so we still have a lot of work to do. But this is where you begin. This is where you start. How many of these chapters do we have in high minority high schools? That might be the very place where we start planting that seed to say, what about being a teacher? I'm here because some kindergarten teacher, while I was playing with the kids in Head Start, said, wow, you're really good with these. You're creative. You're thinking about, how to make this fun. And they still have to learn their ABCs. And you do it. So that's where you start it. Somebody taps you on the shoulder and says, you're really good at this.
How about a round of applause for our great panel here today? If you have any more questions for us, we'll hang around for a little bit, but you can also tweet us at our Twitter handles up there. Also, if you're interested in history, I'll be signing copies of my new book at the South by Southwest Education Bookstore at 4 o'clock. It's called The Invisibles, The Untold Story of African American Slaves in the White House. Thank you all for coming, and once again, we appreciate you listening. Thank you.